Welcome to the Sweet Science of Finding podcast. We have everyone's two favorite guests, Dr. Andrew Usher, Dr. John Babraj. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for coming back on. You guys actually just released your first episode of your guys' podcast, We Do Performance, which is actually perfect timing because you gave me a bunch more questions to ask you guys as we dive down this. So I like about doing this too, because every time I talk to you guys or read more papers and stuff, I think I understand it a little more, and then I have more questions for you, which is perfect. And I think most people will know your background. If they don't, they can check out that episode too. Let's just jump straight into it. We'll go on to the big one that you covered as well, VO2 max. I'll hand it over to whoever wants to take this one first. But VO2 max, and maybe let's just start with what it is, and then we can go into maybe why it is or isn't important for. We don't have to keep it to combat sports, but we can keep it to sports performance.
Yeah. John.
So VO2 max is generally done as an incremental test where the resistance or running speed changes every minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. You use a breath-by-breath gas analyzer. It measures the volume of oxygen that you're taking in and the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming out. And as you get towards fatigue, the amount of oxygen that you can take in plateaus out and you can't take any more oxygen in. And once you reach that stage, you can no longer keep up with the speed or power required for the test. So it's a measure of, I used to say whole body endurance, but I actually think it's a measure of that VO2 max score is a measure of central oxygen use. So it has no reflection on what the skeletal muscle has to do.
And the actual definition is the oxygen you use, oxygen you deliver and use, correct? Or the definition that's often used.
As the highest 30-second average on a stage towards the end of the test. So it's really about the oxygen coming in, but it's not really about how the muscle is using the oxygen. Although that's not to say that incremental testing itself isn't important. The actual VO2 max score isn't necessarily important.
It's a good test.
So the VO2 max score just reflects a general capacity to take in oxygen. If it was really important, I said this in our podcast as well, asthmatics would not be elite athletes because they have such a deficit in oxygen consumption. Yet you could hardly tell if somebody has has asthma, it will have no knock-on effect on performance because the body adapts to that inability to take in lots of oxygen. It's been established for a long time that VO2 max isn't an accurate predictor of endurance performance. So a female could have a higher VO2 max than a male marathon runner, but she won't run a faster time. She'll be about 15 minutes slower. So that VO2 max then is not translating into performance. It doesn't really mimic performance at all. That point of the incremental treadmill test or incremental bike test, how far you go, how long it takes you to get there. For me, that's the most important data point you can get from that test. That reflects the demand that's been placed on the muscle. And at the point of fatigue, that's where you see the muscle has lost its oxygen, has lost its anaerobic glycogen's depleted. So we're now in a state of inability for muscle to contract efficiently. How long that takes is really important. That's a really good marker of how endurance-ly fit an athlete is.
That makes sense. Okay, so you're using the incremental test as more of just like a performance test then versus actually trying to get a VO2 max number.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, from a sports science point of view, VO2 max is the maximum volume of oxygen consumption. And it's either a strict number or it's going to measure via kind of kilograms body weight as well to derive that kind of value. And it's a value I think that's overused and probably misunderstood by people. And I think because everyone's got it on like a Fitbit or they've got it on a Garmin or wherever else. But the crazy thing actually is about those devices is they can be just as accurate as a CPAP machine. So that kind of makes you wonder, if they're just as accurate as a CPAP machine, then how good is the CPAP machine? So, I don't really know. I don't have a lot of issues with the VO2 Max test kit. It's a really good test, as John has said. My issue really comes down to the fact that when you've got influential people pushing VO2 Max without explaining to people that the devices used to get the numbers might not be that accurate, they were in a grey area, right? Because people have been given values that are probably not actually that accurate. I have submerged myself into VO2 Max machines, metabolic carts. I've had Pinoys, VO2 Masters, Cosmeds, Quarks. I've looked at all of them, and they don't always stack up. Is a value, you've got to take it with a little bit of caution. But the test, however, is a very good test, because any test that takes an athlete to the volition is going to really tell you a lot about the athlete. And it's also going to tell you a lot about how the central system, the heart and lungs, are really functioning. And it's also, if you know how to, you get the kit, you can tell you the peripheral, the muscle is going to function. And you see some really interesting similarities, and then you see a lot of disparity between how a muscle actually functions versus how the heart and lungs function. And this is where I think it's important, and I think this is where there's a big change, that we need to understand the difference between systemic and peripheral utilization and delivery, because they are very different in many ways. What different?
Is there, because people kind of like concrete guidelines, is there like a minimum VO2 max or even a minimum time to exhaustion time that you would deem, or like some kind of threshold or cutoff where if you don't meet this, we'll probably need to do some kind of work targeting central function?
We do with athletes,
Yeah,
around time to exhaustion.
yeah.
If we test that, we expect most of the athletes to be able to get to 18 kilometers per hour on a treadmill.
Mm-hmm.
We expect them probably to hit 2 or 3% on a gradient. If they're failing to hit that level, we'll then look to improve that. There's no absolute score. It will depend on how you run the test. So we run 1 minute stages. If you run 2 minute stages, the time's going to be different. So it depends on how you run the test. If you're running 1 minute stages, we would expect somewhere around about 10 minutes, 11 minutes would be where we would expect athletes to be.
I mean, there's always going to be situations where if an athlete's come in and they've, come off an injury, then obviously that test is not going to be a true reflection of where they should be. So, yeah. So, I mean, we're kind of spoiled for choice, though. We don't tend to get athletes like that. So we are tending to deal with elite athletes. So that is probably something that is quite important. Now, in my private practice, I deal with everything from general population. So you have to remember that intensity is a very individualized thing. A 70-year-old is not going to run the same way a 22-year-old is going to run. So, but the intensity in the linear relationship or the polynomial relationship is still going to be there. You're still going to get the data that you need to get. So it's an individual test, but athletes that have a reasonable level, you should be hitting probably 18-1, 18-2 incline. Occasionally, I think the worst we've had is about 7. Well, no, actually,
No.
I'm not going to name who it is, but we have had a couple of UFC fighters, hit very poor scores, like 16, 17 kilometers an hour, and they want to bail out, which is shocking.
What if it's, say, I don't know, a heavyweight fighter, or maybe someone who's overweight or heavyweight fighter that doesn't run? Obviously, as you mentioned, that's going to not be a true reflection of their score because they're not exactly efficient at it. Is there another test you would do, or is that something they just need to build into their routine?
For me, if they're not running, I would transfer to a cycle-based test.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. All you're doing is increasing the power that they have to cycle against every stage.
You can do this loads of ways. You could do this in the bag.
You can do it on a rower, a gauntlet.
Yeah, you can do a heavy bag. And just, because remember, you're using the test just to elicit some information about capacity. So there's 101 ways you can do it, And if you sign up to the Energy Systems Development Workshop, we will shamelessly plug it. Then we will cover all of that, because it's important to understand that what we're interested in is what is occurring systemically and peripherally at volition. Because when you understand what occurs at volition, you know what's going to occur in the build-up to volition. And that build up is where you can dial in other things like where should, for a runner, for example, where should fat max sit for maximum fat oxidation? Because you may want to use that in a camp. But we've had to do this with athletes. We've had to go, right, he's a bit of a chunky monkey. When he's shifting serious weight here, let's dial in a running zone that's a bit more conducive to fat oxidation. Or let's dial in an evening session that's more conducive to that. So there's benefits in that, deriving that from it. But it's just a test at the end of the day. It's really what you do with the test. It's really super important. So, but you can get a lot from the test. That incremental test, even with that gas analysis machine, you can get a lot from it. A hell of a lot from it.
And for anyone listening, when he's talking volition, he's talking volitional failure. And if you want to learn more, I've actually published, put a link in the live chat as well to the mentorship. But if anyone listening, it'll also be in the description for the 2-month mentorship, where Andrew will actually take you through everything conditioning, really. We're talking about like stuff we're going to talk on this podcast, mitochondria, lactate, bust everything down, analyze data so you can actually take it for yourself and do it for yourself. So make sure you check that link because that is down there and that is opening. That starts March 1st will be the actual official start. But it's open because we'll have the forum open and everything for you. But let's continue on this because you guys talked some really interesting points on your podcast too around mitochondria. And I think it was you, John. I'm not going to misquote you, so tell me if I'm wrong. But it was mitochondrial function being more important than mitochondrial biogenesis. Did I get that right?
Yeah, sort of.
Okay, I'll let you go.
What you got to think of in terms of how the body adapts, there's 2 things you can do. You can have more mitochondria, so you create a situation where new mitochondria are formed, or you can remodel the existing mitochondria and get rid of all the damaged proteins within, and they can act in an undamaged way. The point I was making on the podcast is the change you see with generational Highlanders is not more mitochondria. What you see is more efficiency in the mitochondria. So living at altitude for a long period, for generations, creates a situation where the mitochondria get better at extracting very little oxygen that's available. And that is where performance is coming from. So I think that on its own means that the ability to remodel the mitochondria there outweighs the amount of new growth in mitochondria that you're going to get. So it's much better to remodel what's there and make it work better rather than focus on trying to get more in, which might not.
Is that an isolated thing to train? As in, just because you're doing high intensity, say sprints, you're not creating new mitochondria, you are just changing the function?
No, you'll get some new, you get some mitochondrial growth. But the other thing you get with sprints that you don't get with like moderate zone 2 training, is all about creating new mitochondria. Whereas with sprint training, you get a bigger remodeling effect. Because
so you could have it on a spectrum there. Lower intensity, you're creating more mitochondria. Higher intensity, you're remodeling existing as just along a big spectrum.
Yeah, the reality is it's the metabolism. It's intensity drives substrate utilization. So intensity, the human body has to adapt to this environment and intensity. So yeah, that I talk about this quite a lot. Students, underpinning physiology doesn't change that much from person to person. The problem is we just have S&C coaches that don't understand physiology. That's the issue. It's not that they're doing stuff wrong a lot of times. It's just they don't understand the baseline physiology, like this whole idea that we can just isolate out a tiny component of a PCR utilization and train it. Which is absolute batshit nonsense. You hear it all the time. But the reality is unless you're biopsying get some tool you can see into the muscle or see into the blood flow, you can't really 100% determine what is actually happening. And research is a best guess, their best fit at what's occurring, but there's still a lot of unknowns. So nothing is absolute.
Further on that, I'm not going to turn this into a bashing intensity approach, but I want to go a little deeper on that too. I guess if we're talking, say, a high intensity approach like sprints versus, say, a low intensity approach where a lot of people maybe doing zone 2 or even some kind of like long high intensity interval training, are we predominantly then, I guess, targeting slow or fast twitch muscle fibers when we're talking about mitochondria in this instance? So for example, if we're doing a lot of, say, slow, steady runs, are we getting most of those adaptations in the mitochondria then in slow twitch muscle fibers versus sprints where we're maybe looking at the fast twitch muscle fibers?
That'll depend on...
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
at
but
all?
But it'll depend again on this perceived idea of how much muscle fibers are in each muscle. Because you actually look at the research on this and you start to look at, say, you take the rectus femoris and you look at what one research paper has deemed in 1960 over the contribution of type 1 versus type 2 fibers, and then compare it to a 2008 paper, it can be completely different. So you're at the mercy again of trying to eliminate out something to say, oh, this muscle is predominantly type 2, this muscle is predominantly type 1. Just like people will say, you're a predominantly aerobic athlete, you're a predominantly anaerobic athlete. Again,
that's another thing that's happening now is the little categorization of...
So you're in the mercy of trying to determine that. Now, I kind of try to stay... I'm not... I stay away from the muscle fiber thing a little bit because I just train the muscle. I'm not obviously fussed about what fiber type is more glycolytic than the other because I can't tell and I don't know what the fiber split is in the athlete. I've got no way of knowing. So I'm not going to waste time assuming that I can train type 2 fiber. I'm going to train type 1 fiber because I don't know. So I'm just going to train your muscle and I'm going to look at what I do know and what I can see and determine it. Now, steady state training has got a massive place for athletes because we obviously work with a lot of athletes. It's not just combat athletes. It's just the combat athletes in time restricted sports do better on sprints. But if I've got special forces guys and they're doing tactical assault battles, they will do sprints, but we will spend a lot of time dialing in 100 milers. We will dial in where the fat oxidation is, where the pace should change, where it should rein back. Same with ultra runners. We will dial in fat max. We'll look at carbohydrate utilization. We'll look at tolerance levels, and we will utilize that training. Training methods are just there. They're just training methods for individual groups. So, and I am not an anti-runner, right? It's someone that's running a lot of crazy runs. I am, but I'm a time efficient person. So everything in training is about time efficiency to me. It's about what type of adaptation do I need and how quick can I get the adaptation? So, but I have sprints in everything that everybody does. So, everyone does do sprints. Even ultra runners will do sprints for me just because I know I can top up mitochondrial capacity, function, or rate, or however you want to call it. So, I don't want people thinking that steady state doesn't have any benefits because if you're an ultra runner, there is a benefit to understanding your pace. It's like just now, I work a lot with Hyrox athletes and we are looking at things like the transition between the 1K into the ski arc, back into the 1K. We're looking at what is an optimal run pace for that 1K in the first half versus the back half. We're looking at transitional times on wall balls into other things. And we're looking, try to break that sport down into the physiology behind what is needed for that sport. And for me, that sport's a sprint more than anything else. That sport to me is making up the time in the runs if you have a good low 3-minute kilometer or below. And then it's picking up the times on, say, things like the rope. Because a lot of people are very slow. They hit 4 minutes on it. So it's about the physiology. How do we get all that to come together so it can be utilized within the sport and domain? So I don't want people thinking that, there isn't a place for steady state stuff because there is. It just happens to be not in combat sports.
Which is where it's probably used most.
Yeah, which is kind of strange, isn't it? Because if you look at, say, good runners, they will do fast 1Ks, they'll go out to a park run and smash it, and they will change the intensity up. Instinctively, they know they have to go through different intensity domains. Combat sports, in my opinion, is fallen to the mercy of strength and conditioning practitioners. Because as a kid growing up, all the days I did box Francais Savat, I did boxing, I did Muay Thai, I never once seen an S&C coach. We never come across them until probably 2015. And then suddenly they started to appear everywhere with crazy ideas. And some are phenomenal. Some are really switched on, understand what they're doing. And then you have the ones that probably come in with lower level education, that have kind of wangled themselves in, that are sprouting no end of nonsense. And the sad part about that is that the really good practitioners are losing out on the credibility and the visibility to the massy of shit that's floating around. And that's kind of my issue with it. But that's just because I've done a lot of them behind my back today. It's Monday, just another manic Monday.
And the other issue with that is that generally the poorer S&C coaches tend to have a very good social media presence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So guys or athletes will see that and go, here's somebody who's got a high profile. They must know what they're doing. And it's an association of self-promotion equals knowledge.
Well, I do think we're changing. We've had some really super fascinating conversations with young S&C coaches that are really examining a whole heap of things: elasticity, what's its role, what's its purpose, different methods of conditioning, looking at things like triphasic training. Is there anything really there? Is it a method that does have validity, doesn't have validity? There's a lot more questioning going on. And I think that's a really, really healthy thing, because you need to question everything.
100%. And I wanted to touch on as well around, as you mean, well, actually, let's carry on with what we were talking about before around the muscle fiber stuff. I think another bucket that a lot of people are currently doing is trying to categorize athletes based on maybe their endurance profile. This one's more of, say, a workhorse, or someone who doesn't have the high power output end and can just go, versus someone who's maybe more quote unquote twitchy, has power output but can't last. And then they're prescribing different things based on that. It probably comes honestly from the strength world, where you can kind of bucket athletes based on, how well they jump versus how strong they are, etc. So in those instances, you obviously mentioned you just train the muscle. So it's probably not something that you've ever really thought about, but it'll be interesting just to hear your thoughts around, could this be a valid way of actually categorizing an athlete's training just based on maybe some tests where you're thinking, hey, maybe you're more of an endurance profile versus more of a speed power profile?
No. I think it's a reflection of training that we've done in the lead up to a test. So what you'll find is that twitchy, fast guy who can't last has done a lot of work, possibly in the gym, possibly outdoors, whereas that endurance guy that keeps going and going has done a lot more long distance hard work. And it's just a reflection of how we've been training up to that point. There's no real genetic predisposition to be a sprinter or to be an endurance athlete. I know people like to say the Jamaicans have the sprinter gene and the Africans have an endurance gene. There's no evidence of it. And the sprinter gene that they propose for Jamaicans, you find in 95% of the population. So that probably means there's 5% of the population who genetically are unlikely to be good sprinters.
But would there be genetic factors for fiber type distribution potentially then? Maybe the faster, twitchy athletes are drawn to those sports because of their genetic makeup?
I think, so here's the truth about sport. Sport is wealth orientated. Yeah. So as a kid growing up east in Glasgow, my folks didn't have money to send me to running camps or sprint camps, so I did boxing. That's why I was drawn to boxing. Obviously in the UK, we have a very poor sporting pathway. So our talent identification is pretty non-existent at times. So a lot of it comes down to what your family takes you to. Your family takes you to a gymnast class, you start doing gymnastics, you start getting good through the ranks, etc. You go running because maybe your high school has got a running track or whatever. But sport in the UK is very well eliminated, and it still is. So a lot of kids are not being picked because they went through a talent pathway where they've kind of been identified to have, X, Y, and Z ability. It's just that's the sport they've kind of chosen to do, because maybe that's the closest community centre. So maybe that community centre had a Shotokan karate club, so that's why they're doing Shotokan. Maybe it had an ITF Taekwondo club, and that's why they're doing that. I think it's different overseas, but for us, I think it's very much just determining what the kid decides they want to do. So my kid loved long distance running, my lad, and stuff. But when we moved to this end of the world, there was no close long distance running clubs. So I made him do Muay Thai kickboxing with me, which he hated. And he boxed at relatively reasonable level, but didn't want to do it. So, if I was an overzealous parent, I might have went, you got to do boxing because you're pretty good at it. But actually, what he'd have rather done would have been long distance country running. So I'm not so sure. I think genetically you've got what you've got, and our job is to try and leverage what you've got. But the problem we've got is we love to put people in baskets and go, you're an aerobic guy, you're an anaerobic guy, you're a power lifter, you're this. But if you look at like something like GB, I've worked with a lot of GB athletes that have maybe done one sport, and the GB programs went and put them in a different sport. Why? It's because suddenly they think, actually, this sport you're not going to medal in.
You're better suited for this one because of your physiological profile or something.
Yeah, a lot of times it's not. I don't even think a lot of times it's not. I think because I think you have to remember is that we're not physiologically profiling a lot of people. If you think about it, is a counter movement jump really physiologically benchmarking someone? Is a mid-thigh pull really biologically and physiologically doing a... When we start using metrics and we start using terms, we're at the mercy of what those terms mean to one coach versus another coach. And there is no joined up language between coaches a lot of times. So one coach may prefer a counter movement jump, one may prefer like a depth jump, and each will assess based upon that. And I think this is part of the problem. Whereas my approach is very different. We'll have an athlete and we'll put them through a series of tests and look at what the physiology tells us. And then we'll start to squeeze the juice. We'll go, right, we can improve this, we can improve that, we can improve this. That's our approach. Our approach is about improving, not about putting you in a box and saying, you're going to be a phenomenal 60-meter sprinter. That's not my approach. My approach is to go, what is the sport that you want to do? Right, how do we leverage it in your favour? And that's what we do. That's our approach, which is very different to a lot of other approaches out there.
Very. I like that. And I think on your podcast as well, I think physiology trumps the specificity of the exercise.
Right, something you have to.
Yeah.
I want to understand just a little bit because I was to give you an example that happens, I think, in poorly planned rugby preseasons, right? And it's the idea that they spend 8 weeks running their asses off and they start doing contact and then, they're gassing because contact's involved as well. So they're running fit, quote unquote, but they're not rugby quit, quote unquote. I guess you could probably draw the similar parallel, maybe in MMA or something. But I guess at what point does or can focusing on the physiology go too far? Can it go too far? I mean, I'm assuming that because you do a lot of sprints and you talk about freeing up time for technical training, you're just adding more technical training in, so you're probably getting a lot of that exposure anyway. But I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that to be good at the sport, you need to do the sport. Mm-hmm. My job is just purely to accentuate your physiological adaptations to do the sport. I'm very hands off in the sense that unless it's a sport I know intrinsically well, I don't tend to get too involved with the technical side. My job is just to leverage the attributes to make the sport better. But I'm a big believer that you should be spending more time on the pitch, or in the gym doing the sport than doing sport-specific drills for the sport. And I think we fell into this real shit show of functional training. Like 2000s, 2010s, I could name some well-known coaches that popularized this whole stuff, farmers carries and all that crap. And, told people you've got to be a world-class striker because you're going to lift the kettlebell above your head and stroll back and forward, and then you're going to do some duck squats. And they lost track.
Are we talking about like functional patterns right now?
Yeah, all that stuff in functional training, yeah. And they lost sight of the fact that a striker needs to be able to strike. A runner needs to be able to run. The training should be there to accentuate the sport. It shouldn't be there to try and mimic the sport. And I think it still happens. We see people try to mimic motions within the sport without realizing that, there's a difference between throwing something at a fast velocity versus on the resistance weight and throwing at a fast velocity. They're two different things. The matter of the whole heap of things are changing.
Picking up on that, we went down this idea that we forgot about physiology and went, play this sport, we need these sport-specific movements. And you can only get them by mimicking these sport-specific movements. So we ignored the fact that the body doesn't care what stress you put on it. All it does is adapt to that stress that you put on it. It doesn't care if you're on a rowing ergometer, a cycle ergometer, running outdoors. It doesn't care. All it knows is you've asked it to move at speed or create contractions at a rate that is faster than it's used to doing. So in order to do that, when you do that again, it's going to create an adaptation so it's easier to do. So what we needed to think about was not what's the sport-specific movements, but what are the demands, the movement demands that sport's placing on the body, and can we generate them quicker? can we generate them differently? In rugby, there's a lot of focus now on off feet. Can we do stuff away from them being on the pitch?
I mean, we get inundated by rugby coaches wanting CPD chats. They're a big thing. But if you dial it right back to real simplicity, if a hungry bear breaks into the room and the three of us are sitting, the bear doesn't give a shit about if one of us is a 100-meter sprinter, one of us is a 400-meter sprinter, or one of us is a 800 sprinter. The physical body doesn't give a shit about it either. It comes down to, do you have the mitochondria? Do you have the calcium to create the contractile? Can you move the muscle? Because that muscle is going to make you run. And whoever's got the best juice is leaving that room first.
Or I'm going to fight it.
You know? Well, yeah. And if you were like me last year, you're on your pizza diet, that bear is one well-fed bear. You know? But we get so wrapped up in trying to justify what we're doing, which is important because you need to justify it. But we're in this whole thing, like, I see all the time that I can ask myself, why are coaches discussing metabolism in a training manner that's not fit and doesn't have a relationship to metabolism? You know, this whole idea of training this aerobic lactic stuff, we're doing this, we're doing that. Why did that happen? Because we all should know the basic fundamentals of glycolysis, kind of glyconeogenesis, all that kind of stuff. We should know that. We should know how fat oxidizes, and therefore we should know that intensity drives substrate. So why are we trying to teach strikers that they need to be anaerobic, or they have to be aerobic here? Why should an athlete be aerobic for 5 seconds and anaerobic for 55 seconds? It's just all nonsense. It's language that's used with the definition of context. And it's a big, big problem, you know? And it's like, and if anyone is an S&C coach is worth their salt, they should go back and read the papers and look at how intensity and how these contributions are derived. Because if you're still telling people in 2025 that you're isolating out energy systems, then you shouldn't be coaching, in my opinion. We should be moving on. We shouldn't be adding garbage into the mix. We should be now in a position where we know more than we've ever known. And we should be able to get athletes to a much higher level and standard than previously. That should be our job. Well, I don't wake up every day and go, I'm going to devise a new terminology for athletes because it's going to look amazing on Instagram. I don't do that. I wake up on a Monday and I look at my sheet of athletes and I go, right, who's doing what this week? Okay, what was the benchmark numbers last week? Okay, what needs improvement? What does she need? What does he need? Okay, that kid's not on the mark this week. I need to spend a bit more time with them and dial in what's going on. Okay, let's get the logs. Let's get this. That's what my week looks like. It's a constant kind of like playing around with the nuances of training and speaking with coaches and finding out what does the athlete really need, and then find out from the athlete what do they really need. Because there's sometimes a big disparity between what the coach is telling me versus what the athlete is telling me. Happens with the soccer players all the time. The coach is going, I need this, and then you speak to the player, and the player's like, just a really shit game. Why? She didn't feel it. Had a heavy day training day before, was out, blah, 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 blah. So it's a bit marrying it all up until it comes into a nice cohesive system. But I don't think it happens much. I actually think things are going, from what I'm seeing, rather than forward. You know, and I think it's because, in my opinion, I think a lot of S&C courses are not teaching enough physiology about what's actually occurring with people doing exercise.
Or alternatively, S&C coaches don't see beyond the biomechanic movement. So we don't see physiology as an important component of S&C process. And I'm much more thinking about biomechanics and movement over what's driving that movement. You get hung up on joint angles, and a squat you've got to be down to 90 degrees and stuff like that.
But is that because maybe the way we're teaching is really like power phase or strength phase?
It's very strength oriented.
Yeah, is that maybe the issue?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you take like a combat athlete, what does the combat athlete really need? You know, we never really talk about things like spatial awareness, how good that spatial awareness needs to be. And how trainable is spatial awareness? And is there a physiological function behind spatial awareness? But I'll see people do 95 bloody minutes on an agility ladder with no context about why they're doing it. And people get very upset when I talk about agility ladders. So, fuck you. Agility ladders.
Is that because spatial awareness is a technical skill that's developed through doing the sport?
Yeah, but...
So within a sense of S&C, it probably shouldn't be a focus of S&C because It's a technical and tactical component of the sport.
Yeah, but it's got a time date. It's got, if you break it down.
It does. I
yeah,
agree.
but if you break it down, you've got time to peak acceleration, you've got time to break in. That's all muscle physiology. How does the muscle contract?
Yeah.
How does it accelerate? How does it decelerate? Where's the eccentric component of it? Where's the braking element of it?
But you've hit something on the head there when you said that's how the muscle contracts. When you speak to an S&C coach, they'll talk about a stretch shortening cycle. That's not how the muscle contracts.
No.
That's a description of a movement process. The muscle's contracting by cross-bridge formation. So they're not going deep enough into the muscle. They're stopping at that biomechanical stretch shortening, lengthening, shortening. So we're not going beyond the biomechanical into what's actually happening.
The whole stretch shorten cycle is probably been one of the biggest curses on strength conditioning, I think. Because I think it's become a very like murky world of what's a plyometric, what's not a plyometric. And kind of is a plyometric purely because of that function. And there's no real thought about why are you trying to create it and what's the process behind creating it and where does it actually sit within the actual sporting domain itself. And I think this is kind of a ramble, but anyway, I think this is kind of like one of the big issues for me is this whole idea that we do often do too much because we have to think we have to tick every single box. And a lot of times I won't do that. I'll just look at what can I leverage and what needs to be improved and what can I just go, we don't need to touch that. We can just leave that alone. You know, like my pet hate at the moment is asymmetry, right? Because there's a big tendency with physios to measure asymmetry use. And I just have a real issue with this whole idea that we're going to trust a piece of hardware that's used to measure 300 different tests. That's got a tiny transducer on it. And we're going to say to an athlete, you've got a 12% asymmetry between left leg and right leg, so therefore you shouldn't do a run today. Because I wouldn't trust a device that does 300 tests. Should tell me anything. But yet...
Well, are people actually taking an asymmetry test like weekly and then deciding what they're going to do based on that asymmetry weekly?
No, it's probably just whenever you can pay to see your physio. So it could be 3 weeks, could be 4 weeks. But, you know, it happens a lot. I mean, we get referred to a lot of athletes, you know, because they're maybe injured or they're coming up. I mean, we actually quite a lot of that. People ask us to take a look at an athlete, are they ready to return? And a lot of times, you kind of sit and you look at the notes and you think to yourself, this doesn't make any sense, and the other thing we see a lot of is physios morphing into S&C roles and trying to apply physiotherapy kind of like drills in an S&C style context. And that's kind of interesting.
There's very rarely any overload.
Yeah. Or they go the opposite, which is I've seen lately where they go too much overload.
Oh, I've heard some horror stories on that. My God, career-ending stuff.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of like a strange world we live in. That I think everyone's clamoring to try and find maybe their own place, but I think we should be stripping things back to kind of really what the athlete needs in order to be, you know, the best that they can be for the particular sport, and that's really what we should be doing. We shouldn't be overly complicating things, I don't think. You know,
so what are you looking at then when you're looking at for what an athlete needs based on, let's just say some of the NAERS testing you've done and maybe just like the time to exhaustion test? Are you looking at, okay, you're on and off, something to do with the on and off kinetics? I know I've seen some of your graphs there, you know, on and fast, on and off kinetics. Are you looking at, okay, you're not recovering fast enough, so we need to manipulate what we're doing in the sprints here, or maybe it's not switching on fast enough, so we need to manipulate some of the sprints we're doing here? Is that kind of what you're looking at for prescription?
So the muscle needs to be able to use option in order to function. So it doesn't matter what the sport is. If the muscle cannot utilize...
Even if it's anaerobic, right?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as an anaerobic sport.
Unless it's anaerobic, aerobic, lactic, B-lactic, C-lactic, or whatever the hell people want to call it. But the reality is, it doesn't matter what the sport is, the muscle needs to contract, okay, for locomotion to occur. Oxygen needs to get into the muscle, and the muscle needs to be able to use the oxygen. So in order for the muscle to contract at a rate that's applicable, then there's a relationship between oxygen utilization. So what we're looking for with the NAERS is really to determine how well is that individual able to use a muscle, and how well is that muscle able to recover in order to go again. Because it's very unusual you have a sport where you only do one thing and nothing else. It's very unusual. And the other thing is that people don't understand as well is that if you have, say, 12 nerve sensors and you put it on vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, maybe rec fem, bicep femoris, maybe semimembranosus, semitendinosus, none of those muscles are going to use oxygen at the same rate.
No.
There's a difference, right? Because they're prime movers, there's agonists, antagonists. Makes sense, right? And we forget that as well. So, but what nurse is allowing you to do is to go, well, this muscle is using at this rate, this muscle is using at that rate. Or sometimes you'll even go, why is this particular one muscle using it at too fast a rate? Or why is it not using it at a fast enough rate in relation to every other muscle? So what we're really looking to do is just to look at how is this person performing centrally and peripherally. And then we're looking to marry up. So if you come in and you are unable to extract oxygen at a reasonable rate, that's where we will look at things like sprints, because sprints are going to create enough metabolic stress in order to create that need to extract oxygen. If you don't create a need, you're not going to create a change in it. You have to create a need for it. The muscle needs to have it. So one of the things that people misunderstand about sprints is the sprints are there to create a big enough metabolic demand and a cascading falling metabolic demand. The first one is everything. That is what's creating that need to extract oxygen. And that's why we do it. And we will base prescriptions off of that. So that's how we prescribe.
And then how are you then determining how long, the work interval of a sprint and a rest interval of a sprint based on that data?
There's two things we're really looking at. With nerves, we can delve a lot more into what we muscle. Because we've done that a lot, we can also look at heart rate and but what we're looking at is not necessarily the absolute change, but the shape of the change. How's that changing? Is it predominantly linear into a nice flat, steady state? Or is it a slow curve slope? So it's not activating fast enough. That recovery, how quickly is it coming back? Do we get a nice linear, or is it in a different curve shape? That means it's taken longer for the muscle to recover. So it's about looking at shapes, really. That's what I say, and it's always about looking at the shape. The absolute numbers are just the numbers. It's the shape of how you get to those numbers that's important.
So and you want to you're looking for like a really sharp decline and then a really sharp incline, correct?
So let's take some for example. So take sparring, around the sparring, you've got a heart rate monitor. So the question you need to ask yourself is, what are you expecting to see? Okay? Because red zone gets touted all over the place. But the reality is you should get to red zone. Okay?
Yeah.
But the more interesting thing is what is the variance in your top end before you hit recovery? Okay, because that's telling you what the heart is doing. So getting to maximal heart rate should occur relatively quite quick because that's your on kinetics. But even within the time it takes you to get to the max heart, you'll either be in a linear relationship where you'll be in a straight trajectory, or you'll be in a curved, like a mono exponential relationship, or you may be polynomial in the sense that you may have a rise, a plateau, and a rise. And each of those three things tells you something very different. One will tell you that they're able to switch on really fast. One will tell you it's slightly delayed. And one will tell you there is maybe a bit of cardiac drift occurring because there's an inability to really rise to that top maximal heart rate. So that alone tells you how that round is starting off. Then when you're in the round, the variance between beats to beat, the mean absolute deviation, will tell you how much is the heart rate varying the round. So how much is the stress changing during the round. And then when they stop and they walk to the corner, you're looking at, in the duration between fight stopping and getting to the corner, how much delay is there before that heart rate starts to recover? And then you have the opposite side to your on, because then you're looking at, okay, what does the heart rate recovery look like? Is it a linear straight line? Is it a curved line? Or is it a wiggly woggly kind of like polynomial, second order or third order polynomial?
I think that was mine when I sent you mine a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So very rarely do you see a linear straight line. Now, the reason I'm super excited about our high rocks athlete, James, is not only did our treadmill not go fast enough for him, which was kind of interesting, but he's got some of the sharpest linear heart rate recovery I've ever seen. You'll be listening to this probably, so you're doing well. But we can push harder, James. We can push a lot harder, and we shall be pushing harder. But he's got a very interesting recovery, right, which is very unusual. So even after thousands and thousands of hours of sessions, I'm still able to see things that are very unusual. Okay, but that's how you can use basic heart rate. You have to understand, what does it mean. Just looking at the fact that, which more early stage career coaches will go, right, you're 180 beats when you finish that round, and before you went back out to the next round, you've dropped 20 beats. That's really good. It's not bad. But if the first 15 seconds of that was no decline in heart rate, that's maybe not so good. Because it shows that although you've dropped the 20 beats, you're very slow in how your heart has relaxed enough in order for you to do that. So that could be changes and other things. So there's a whole way of using physiological data without having fancy tools or gadgets that you can start to dial it in. But it takes a little bit of understanding and learning about why you're doing it and what you're actually looking for. The problem is, people get shiny new gadgets and they go, well, I'm using a nurse device. So what?
And the other thing people like is an absolute number.
Yes.
So my VO2 max is, going back to what we talked about at the start, my VO2 max is 50. Isn't that good?
So
my heart rate drops 30 beats across a minute. Isn't that good?
So
well, that's not telling us anything, because movement's kinetic. It can't be defined by one number. So you have to look at the shape all the time. What's the shape of it? Starting the movement, are we getting up nice and fast into a nice steady state? Because that means the body's working efficiently. If we can get to a steady state quickly, we've changed the homeostasis point and the body's now comfortable. So can we do that quickly? Is there a delay? Does it start and then stop and then start again? So you have to look at the full data set, not just what's the maximum, what's the minimum, or what's the maximum value, because the maximum value can't tell you very much.
And if you look at VO2 max, then you'll see that VO2 max can look to someone like it's very linear, but it's actually polynomial. And we're going to write a paper on this, that it's not mono exponential, it's a polynomial, because VO2 max is a rise, a pause, and a rise. And this is how we determine VT1 and VT2 and all those kind of ventilation thresholds and stuff. So there is no absolutes. Anytime I hear absolutes, like Gary Hutt will send me a gift from the Siths from Star Wars and say, we do not deal in absolutes. It always makes me kind of laugh when I think of absolutes and relative numbers. But it's true. It's like we have a tendency of wanting to deal with absolutes. It's like we always tell athletes, when you come to the lab, your numbers are today's numbers. They're only valid for today. Tomorrow they'll be different. So let's not get too stressed about it. It's about trend over time and changes that you see over time. That's where you make big differences in athletic performance, is understand how an athlete performs over time and being able to analyze and spot when something has went wrong in the week. And that's how you identify it. And to me, that's when physiology comes alive, is when you can spot these things and go, something's happening here. It's very unusual. What's been occurring? And that's when you can pick up a whole heap of things, injuries, flus, immune function compromise, and you can then change the program to kind of really get ahead of it really, really quickly. So there's a massive application to understand how you use data.
To give you more absolutes then, let's talk heart rate zones. Because obviously you mentioned red zone before. And I think, say someone's listening to this, they're like, fuck all that. I just want to do something really simple and easy. Is heart rate zone a valid way for someone to start planning, prescribing, and doing their conditioning?
No, because when I go for a run without a heart rate monitor, I know when I'm goosed. I don't need a heart rate monitor to tell me I'm fucked. So, heart rate data is useful from my end as the physiologist, but I have my athletes wear the device, but take the watch off and leave it on the table so they can't see it. I don't want them looking at it too much. Unless it's like we're doing a big competition for ultra running and we're trying to maintain a pace, then I'll have them look at it. But I'd rather them understand how their body feels to determine what their heart rate zone is. So, for example, with boxers on the heavy bag, part of the training for that is we will have them go all out in the bag to feel what maximal heart rate feels like. I will then ask them, I want you to take your heart rate down. Okay? And then I'll be able to tell them that's too low. That's you now coasting, right? Take me to a midpoint between where your maximal heart rate is and where your coasting point is. Because I don't have the luxury of wearing a heart rate monitor in a competition. But I can get the luxury of having them realize how it feels to be in certain zones, so that they know when they're pushing too hard and they know what it should feel like when they take a step back, in order to get performance a bit more tailored in chaotic environments. Running's a little bit easier because you can dial in a little bit more. So so the thing you also remember at heart rate zones is it can vary as well. So nutritional status, hydration status, dehydration status will all play a big effect. So
also using heart rate zones to try and elicit muscle zones.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is change how the muscle's working. If you're saying you're in this muscle zone or this muscle zone, people won't understand what you're talking about. So we try and use heart rate because it's an easy concept, but it's a central concept, so it's not really reflecting the demand placed on the muscle. And if we're not placing the right demand on the muscle, we'll get central cardiovascular adaptations that have no influence on performance.
Yeah. But the other thing as well is NURS is going down this big route where obviously there's a lot of apps out there that are trying to determine zones, you know, stage 1 recovery, stage 3 recovery. And I don't touch any of that stuff. For me, NURS is purely an abstract value of change. And that change is how much hemoglobin and myoglobin availability there is. That's all there is. And I think, obviously, when companies produce tech, they want apps so they can sell their tech, which is fine. I'm just not a massive lover on this whole idea of trying to eliminate out what an optimal NURS training zone will be. Because I can tell you from 5 years of using NURS, it's not that easy. It's not that easy. You know, just getting the sense of the muscle belly at times can be a challenge. And keeping it there during intense workouts can be a challenge. Yeah. So the fact that people think they can put it on and determine that you're in an anaerobic zone is just kind of like, I'm like, yeah, good luck to that. You know, it's like, because I think one of the big things about sports science and technology is we use it often to really undermine the athlete's ability to know themselves. Mm-hmm. Good athletes know. You know, yeah. I don't have issues with athletes phoning me up and going, my heart rate was only 122 today and it should have been at 127. I don't have that issue. None of them care. None of my athletes give a shit about the heart rate data. They wear it because the old guy asked for it and it shuts them up. They don't even do it. They wear the NURS device because he's going to just bawl at me if I don't wear it. Because all they care about is the program they get on a Sunday. What am I doing? Because they have enough faith that they're getting enough change and they can see the change and they can feel the change, that they don't need a heavy, prescriptive kind of heart rate zone style workout. You know, I've got people running 227, 237 1Ks. I've got everyone under 20 minutes in a 5K. None of them are going, oh, I need to push, I need to change. You know, this whole idea of, red zone training is just an absolute lot of bullshit. Because we will get into maximal heart rate because intensity will take us there. What's more important is how do you get out of it and how quick can you get back in it. That's more important. Kinetics is much more important than try to sell your £99 blueprint on how you're going to get yourself into a red zone, which seems to me to be quite kind of like scammy, if I'm brutally honest about it. So
shots fired on a Monday morning. I mean, yes. You've already been attacked this morning.
It's not cutting weight and lack of caffeine. That's what it is.
You've already been. You said you usually check your athlete stuff and do all the stuff on Monday morning, but I think you were checking your DMs today with all the all the messages you're getting. But let's touch on that topic though quickly to finish up this podcast, so I'm not taking all your time. But let's go into lactate, and let's just go into some of the myths surrounding lactate and maybe why it probably is important for someone to actually do exercise that raises your lactate more than the 2 millimoles that people are trying to typically avoid.
So the first thing about lactate I'm going to say is it is lactate, not lactic acid.
I'm going to get death threats now.
Lactic acid
I mean, I think
does not form in the
most people
human
know.
body at
Most people know that now.
37 degrees centigrade. It
No, they
immediately
don't.
dissociates into lactate. So at no point do you form lactic acid. It's just not, chemically, it's not possible at that temperature to form lactic acid. So what we form is lactate. So it's a really important point. And then all lactate is glycolysis happening, where the extent of pyruvate getting into the mitochondria has maxed out, and we've got a shift to lactate to allow glycolysis to continue. What happened, the fate of that lactate is determined by the athlete's training status. If they are a well-trained athlete, that lactate will then go into an intracellular shuttle where the lactate produced in the muscle moves to the mitochondria in the muscle and gets used for energy. As the intensity gets up and that shuttle then gets swamped, we start to put it out into the bloodstream and other tissues will start to use it. So it's all about how well we can use that lactate that we produce as a fuel source.
So you would think people understand this, but they don't. Example being, I'm having my dinner last night, I get a telephone call from somebody I don't know. And he says to me, got an athlete, it's really struggling. I've got some photographs, can I show you? And I'm thinking, that's a bit suspect. Anyway, not the normal, but anyway. And I said to them, well, before you show me any photographs, what is the problem? They went, lactic acid, it's everywhere. And I'm like, what do you mean it's everywhere?
the demon.
Right? And he showed me a photograph of this athlete's legs that are green. And initially I'm thinking to myself, is there sepsis? Is there some is there some kind of medical issue here? And he's like, no. He said, we've been really rubbing it out really hard. And I'm like, what the hell have you been rubbing it with? And he's got one of these really big circular foam rollers, the plastic ones, and he has been doing push-ups on this athlete's leg.
So it's just bruised?
Oh, it's bruised. It's green with bruising. And I'm like, why are you doing this? And it's like, because of the lactate build-up, but it's the way to get it out. And I'm like, you shouldn't be coaching. And then today I post about it, and people still seem to think we have lactic acid, we're like alien and predator, and kind of we're squirting this stuff. And it gets back to this whole idea of metabolism. A lot of coaches don't appreciate metabolism. They don't appreciate glycolysis. They don't understand that pyruvate is a byproduct. They don't understand NDH. They don't understand how that stuff comes together in order to do lactate shoveling and the importance that lactate has. And it's a big issue. And it shouldn't be a big issue in 2025 with S&C coaches. But this is why we see stuff like people doing aerobic alactic training sessions.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't.
That's exactly why.
Yeah, because they don't understand metabolism. Because if they understood metabolism and substrate utilization, they wouldn't talk that nonsense. So I'm going to get T-shirts that are kind of made up. It says, bring back metabolism. Make metabolism great again. There we go. Because it's kind of one of these things that's very important to understand. It's really important to understand because that's what dictates the intensity level that you're going to have your athlete work at. That's what takes sprint interval training. That's kind of like, it's kind of, it's like it's a chicken and the egg, kind of like Oxford is chicken and egg scenario, really. Can you have anaerobic metabolism without it?
I mean, it's just, it's a myth that has perpetuated. Commentators in sports shows don't help.
Oh, yeah. The Olympics is
they'll tie in build up of lactic acid, that's causing burning in the muscle, that's where you get this pain. And it's not like, there's been lots of studies done. You put nerves into high lactate solutions, nothing happens. There's no pain reception, there's nothing. Lactate doesn't stimulate nerve activation. However, swelling in muscle does stimulate nerve activation and cause pain. Because what happens when you're doing exercise is you create a lot of contraction and fluid gets trapped in the muscle. So the muscle actually expands a little bit, which puts pressure on the myofascial sheath around the muscle where the nerve endings are located. So that's what causes the pain when you're at that intense zone. It's just the amount of contraction that you're having to do and the amount of blood that's pooling in the muscle. It's nothing to do with lactate at all. Lactate's just a byproduct of glycolysis. And it's just whether your body can use it or not. That determines whether you're going to fail or not. Because if you can't use it, it's a waste product. It's no longer a byproduct, it's a waste product.
And we know from the boxing literature, if you dive into that, you know, look, Mitch Finley's got a systematic review out where he's got all that data in it, which I hate to say it, he beat me to it, but his is actually better than probably mine's would have been. Fair play, Mitch. So it's a good systematic review. But he lists all, he shows it. But, you know, if you look at it, you'll see that boxing seems to have a higher lactate level post-sparring than, say, karate, taekwondo, and some other combat sports. There's no MMA in it, though, because none of that stuff was done at the particular time when these studies were conducted. So they're earlier studies. But it shows that, you know, so this is where this comes from, this whole idea of, is boxing aerobic or anaerobic? Because way back in around 95, Asset Gosh did the initial study, which was a heart rate and treadmill correlation test. And he just correlated the heart rate to kind of incremental kind of runs and came up with this ludicrous idea that, you know, boxing was 80% anaerobic and only 20% aerobic. And this was conducted in a test that measured no substrates. So how he came to that conclusion is a complete mystery. But obviously, early in the day, there's not a lot of other research papers there. People go with the idea. It perpetuates the myth. Then Phil Davis does his paper and he spins it and he comes out with a complete actual opposite number. That it should be 80% and 20%. And I did a pilot study because I was thinking of doing a substrate paper originally. Did this. My PhD originally was going to be substrate utilization. wasn't nurse. And I spent a lot of time with Pinoys, VO2 masters, all sorts of Cosmed K4Bs. I did pad work, I did bag work, and you see what you expect to see. Early rounds, predominantly fat oxidization. As intensity increases, a shift to carbohydrate utilization. We're not 80%, 20% either way. We just are what we are, depending on the intensity that you put in.
Intensity, the importance working it.
Yeah. So lactate is really irrelevant because it is just showing you the intensity level that people participated at that particular point in time. However, people are using lactate scouts, people are using Biosense machines. The accuracy versions, ratings are vastly different. A lactate scout, I can tell you, I've got two of them in a bag that I've gathered in dust. The accuracy in those things is very, very debatable and sketchy at the best of times. But people keep telling me, oh, I've got an athlete with 2 millimoles. And I'm like, well, that's probably just because the lactate strips are maybe getting near their date. Or maybe been sitting in a warehouse. The machine isn't calibrated. Are you really going to go on a device? It goes back to these, you know, valve kind of dynamo machines. Are you really going to trust a machine that does 300 device measurements? Are you going to trust a tiny little lactate scout device that's taking a tiny little strip and making a correlation on a capillary fingertip kind of blood? If you're going to measure things, you're going to have to measure them right. Otherwise, there's no point. But that's the whole issue. So lactate, we know. I think it works out of boxing. Most of the research reviewing the systematic review shows something about 14 millimoles, I think, post-sparring. I think karate was about 12. So it was kind of like, so they deemed, therefore, that boxing was much more highly anaerobic. And that's the truth. That's how we got to this messy world in boxing that for a lot of years people thought running around gym halls holding your breath was good training because it was anaerobic. And I seen that done at a national boxing camp. Kids running around holding their nose because it was anaerobic training. I remember thinking to myself, if I was to staple my testicles to the table, I'd have more fun than watching this. This was like the most painful thing I'd ever watched in my life. You know, high-level coaches thinking that they're making kids to anaerobic training by running around the hall holding their breath.
Gosh. I've got one more follow-up question for you then on lactate and around the idea of obviously the bunk term of anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold, etc. Is there any value in training at the so-called lactate threshold? I mean, we can keep it to combat sports, or we can even go outside of combat sports. Is there something there where people can use that as an intensity measure?
Combat sports, I'd say no, because how you determine it. Cycling, potentially, yeah. Ultra running, yeah. Special forces work, Potentially, yeah.
So things like ultra running, it becomes important around what pace can you maintain for full competition.
But in boxing, if it's amateur boxing and you're like get 9 minutes of work, is it really that relevant? If you're doing championship fight, the 36 minutes of work, is it really that relevant? And how are you actually going to assess it practically when they're in the ring? How are you going to know that? Because as soon as you step in the ring, there's a big difference between sparring and competition. You've got different levels of cortisol flying around and epinephrine and all sorts of good stuff flying around. There's a massive change in vasodilation. There's a whole heap of things that will change that kind of lactate reading. So it's probably, I think it's valuable for a lot of other sports, but I would never do it in combat sports. I just don't see any value in it. I see it being used a lot. There's two things that I really find interesting at the moment because I'm on a rant today. It's Monday rant, and this is therapy, so I'll send checks and posts, gentlemen.
I'll send you the invoice later.
The thing that I find the most interesting at this moment in time is the fact there's a lot of S&C coaches buying VO2 master devices, which are good devices, but they cannot ascertain substrates because they do not have a CO2 sensor. So if you, as an athlete, are paying good money to get RMR tests and substrate utilization tests, that device can't do it. It physically does not have the components to do it. Okay? But I'm seeing these kids giving people RMR tests and giving them kind of like substrate tests. You're using fats, you're using this. And I'm like, well, you don't have a CO2 sensor. So how are you even deriving VO2 and VCO2? So that's a big issue. The other issue, you're seeing people using a lot of different cheap knockoff brands of lactate monitors and try to elicit, threshold change. All you have to do is watch the spar. Go watch them spar. That's all you need to do. You don't need a lactate monitor. I can just go into the gym and see my athlete spar, and I can tell you who's working and who's not working. I don't need any fancy technology. Just watch the spar. Understand the sport and watch the spar. Which is why I always think if you're going to be involved in a sport, at least try and be involved in it in some capacity, because then you understand what the athletes have to actually go through, and then you can really plan and periodize, I think, a bit more effectively. But yeah, there's a big thing at the moment. People giving a lot of physiological advice to athletes, and I look at the kit they're using and I go, that's a near impossibility.
That hasn't hit my algorithm yet.
Well, after this.
Yeah. My phones are singing on me and stuff, and yeah, I'm probably going to start seeing a bunch of stuff. I've actually had Caleb Hanley, who was on the podcast recently. He started sending me coaches talking about lactic acid to screw up my algorithm as well. So, I mean, it's going to happen.
The thing is like, I kind of appreciate that people want knowledge and they want to try and educate athletes, and I think that's wonderful, right? And we need a lot more of that. But please put a little bit of time into going reading some things that are tense.
And doing the mentorship, of course.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, obviously my vision this year is, and it's a shameless plug, folks, is reason for doing the mentorship is to try and kind of help guide maybe those that don't have a university education or those that are working in elite sport into a much more modern context of what they should be looking at. Because we do a lot of CPD for clubs and individuals, and the same things come up time and time again. And it all centers around substrates and kind of intensity and training volume. It all seems to center that. So that's the plan. The next thing we're going to launch after that will be the Nutrition 101, which will be a primer for people to understand the fundamentals of it. And then the biggie later this year will be Sports Science 101. And that is really going to be geared up for people that don't want to go to university, that don't have the funding. So it's not going to be university styled. It's going to be lower than university undergraduate, but not far off it, to allow people. And it should hopefully also serve as maybe like a nice primer for people to go, you know what, I quite fancy going to uni and learning sports science or exercise physiology or whatever else. And that'll be a very special course because we're going to have loads of contributors to that, and it's going to be pretty wicked. So some good stuff to come.
Yep. And make sure you check the description, guys, because I've got a link down there. You just check your email and then I'll send you the details for the first mentorship. And then obviously if everything else that comes out, you'll also get that too. But I know we've gone over our hour and you guys probably have things to do, but I appreciate you coming on. Where can people find and follow you guys? I know, John, you don't do much on social media.
Do anything. So I do have an Instagram account, but I don't post anything.
Why?
Just follow the podcast.
Why?
We do performance.
Yeah.
Yes, over podcast.
Do we have an Instagram page for that? We don't. I should set that up, actually. That's how really unprepared we are with this stuff. And like, I just get death threats now. So there's a good chance if you send me something, and I sometimes I miss people's messages because I've got somebody dealing with kind of filtering, because I do get a lot of real crazy stuff. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to write.
That's crazy. I can't believe you got so many people coming at you for lactate stuff.
I get it for everything though.
You do.
I get a lot of abuse on it. But people don't like the truth, man. When I tell them that the Earth's not flat, they go batshit mental. It's kind of like, yeah, it's interesting. No, I get quite a lot. I've not actually had a death threat in a while, come to think of it. The last one was, they're going to come and murder me in my sleep, and my wife and son and stuff. That was an interesting one.
Well, because of exercise physiology?
Yeah, yeah. I think because I said something along the lines that boxing was, based upon the research from Miles, was a bit more steady state than we perceived. It wasn't.
Oh yeah, based on your paper with the Rick.
Yeah, because it was. Yeah. It is, you're right, because it's interesting because you look at it, from a muscle physiology perspective anyway, once you get beyond that first probably 20, 30 seconds, there is an attempt for the muscle to try and go into equilibrium or steady state. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you're going to be efficient, you're not going to constantly bleed oxygen. You're going to try and regulate yourself. So I posted that and somebody sent me a death threat, which is,
I'm going to have to run, or I'm going to be late for the next meeting.
I would say if you're going to give me death threats, articulate them slightly better. So yeah, it is crazy. It's a crazy world out there. So
was it a coach that sent you death threat over that? Like a coach or an S&C coach?
That was an S&C coach on that particular occasion. Yeah, it is. It's kind of like who would have thought it? That sports science would have been so volatile.
Well, if you see what goes on in the strength bodybuilding world around the idea of lengthened position training for hypertrophy and stuff like that, my God, that is like, right now, that is the big thing that everyone is fighting over. And it's like legit, like people hating on other people just for taking a stance.
Obviously me and John have a very, we're quite clear about it because we're old. We're dinosaurs. But we've been around, right? We have a very biased view of what we do because we have a very focused.
We've been doing it for so long too.
Yeah, but we work. But the thing is we do work with elite athletes, so we're not theoretical physiologists. We actually do it as a job, and I do it separately. Obviously, John's obviously university based and everything else, and I'm not. I'm just in to do research. My whole private practice is really with athletes winning and succeeding. So if I wasn't good at my job, I wouldn't be living in my big house, right? So it's kind of like, do you know what I mean? It's kind of like, so it's very, for me, everything is really, really fundamentally grounded in the ability to actually do it. But people get very upset, I guess, if you kind of maybe question their viewpoints on things. Oh, but it shouldn't lead to death threats. Sometimes I wonder if it's just bots, because some of the language is pretty interesting.
It's probably a death threat through ChatGPT or something.
Yeah. Please send a death threat to this physiologist. Because he mentioned lactate. It's like, I'm going to come and slice your lactic acid open. I do get it's interesting. It's kind of, and I think doing the podcast is kind of interesting because it's opened me up to a whole new world of people that I didn't know existed.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't even realize that was such a big thing. I've just been posting some memes on that stuff, and people seem to be enjoying them so far. I have to create some more memes on that and see if I can maybe I can get some of my own.
Yeah, you've not made it until someone stopped you, apparently. So I'm not quite at that level yet, I don't think.
Well, a random physiology question that I was just thinking of now regarding, Charles, we can just carry on for a little bit if you got a bit of time, but I guess the use of like high intensity interval training. So let's just say like long intervals, short intervals. A lot of the time it's prescribed off either max heart rate, so like 80 to 95% max heart rate if you're doing something like where you can't prescribe distance of time, or maybe it's just based off a maximal aerobic speed number. I don't even know if I have a question on this really, but other than like applicability, where do you see that fitting in a schedule where you're really focused on what's happening at the muscle, you're looking at trying to extract as much oxygen as possible and get that thing going to put the stressor in there. These intervals aren't, I guess, as stressful because they're not as intense, but where do you see value in there, or in those modalities for an athlete?
Probably maintenance more than anything else. Once you've got reasonable kind of mitochondrial adaptation, you kind of want to maintain it. So you need a percentage of stress applied in order to maintain it. So I kind of could factor it in there. A lot of times as well, like, say for example, I have an athlete and in sparring, I just feel they maybe lack just that, have a bit of a lack of ability maybe to have a second phase of attack. So they may be kind of quite good at coming in, they're setting themselves up with a jab, they're throwing the backhand lovely, but they just seem to lack that second phase of attack and that aggression and that power to land that particular strike. Power's not a great word, but you know what I mean?
Yep.
So a lot of times in the bag, I will drill their intervals to give them a bit more of a rest break. So I may go, give me 10 on, give me 30 off, use that 30 just to kind of really reset yourself, focus in position, focus on the biomechanics of striking, and then go again, boom. And I will use it as a technical drill, but at the same time, I'm getting an interval out of it. And that's much more kind of moderate style. Kind of MICT, or kind of moderate intense continuous training, I don't tend to use it that much just because it's too much time. So I will mainly go with super maximal sprints, or I'll go with kind of high intensity style interval training. So it'll be more that style. The bag work is not super maximal, okay? Because it's very difficult to go super maximal on a heavy bag, you know, doing some crazy shit. So that is probably much more high intensity training than anything else. Now, it does vary as well. So sometimes, like this week, I think it's some lads on 10 on 5 off for the whole 3-minute round, and it's 12 rounds, and we'll just be banging and hitting. And that, I'm really looking at straight line attacks for those rounds. So that's like technically driving it as well. So a lot of times I'll sit with a boxing coach, or I'll sit with Davey, and Alvin will think, right, this athlete needs this, you know, and we'll kind of try and lock in good technical components on the bag, but on an intensity level. And one thing we do not do anymore is let boxers control their own bag sessions, because that's where you see this whole drop off in the intensity level. You know, and they just meander in zone 2 for like 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And then they tell you need a shower, and you're like, you don't need a shower, you're not worked hard enough for a shower.
No dinner for you.
Yeah. I like the bag session to be really super technical. So for example, say Fraser Wilkins is in a competition and he said he's fight, we will take feedback off the fight, we'll look at what things worked, what things didn't work, and we will shape that into his intervals. So we might have a move around the bag, he may pivot off the bag, he may hit 1-2 half step back of the backhand, follow him with a lead hook, and we'll kind of start building that in a more explosive combination, or we'll drill certain things off of it. Or it could just be we just want in and out the bag, first phase of attack, second phase of attack, breakaway, center position, come back in. So we will drill that. I will do that with other sports as well. So I may take a 100-meter sprinter and we will break up the sprints into like 60-meter sprints, and we will look at the kinetics of what's occurring there and devise intervals around getting out the blocks into the upper position and then driving forward. So there's a whole heap of ways you can do it. You can break them up any way you want. And that way, you're still getting all your technical skills, but you're kind of getting the added benefit. You're getting a lot of heart rate increase, and you're getting a little bit more drive and intensity, and you can maintain the mitochondrial adaptation. When it comes to the adaptation, the best way again is bike sprints. And that's just because it's the easiest way to create such a big metabolic stress in a safe environment. No. So that's kind of why I would do it.
And it's like those specific intervals are almost kind of like an in-between, like almost like a little specific transfer, quote unquote, kind of thing between what you're doing on the bikes than what you're doing actually in the sport.
Yeah, so the bike is we will do 3 sessions a week on the bike, religiously, pretty much. If an athlete's tight for time or they're traveling and they're not going to have a reasonable bike, we'll maybe do 1 a week. But generally they're on 3 a week. Most of my athletes are on 3 a week. My high rocks, every athlete I have is doing bike sprints. It doesn't matter whether you're a javelin thrower, you're a high rocks athlete, it doesn't matter, we're doing them. I do them for 2 reasons. 1, because I want the mitochondrial adaptation, and 2, I want the mindset to give it everything.
Dude, it's so... I dread every time I go on the guys. I haven't done them in a little bit, but I think I wore the brakes out on my spin bike.
Oh,
oh, I rolled the resistance out, so the top resistance doesn't work as well now. So I need to get.
It's kind of it's interesting because once you get that mindset of all out, you start to foster that mindset of all out in other areas. That I can go, I can recover, I can push, I can relax, and I think that's why we use them. But you know, and we'll cover this in our own podcast. We do a whole heap of other stuff as well. It's not sprint related. So there's a whole heap of other training that we do. So we're just saying that sprints is one small tool in the toolbox that you can get a crazy amount of return on your investment. There's a whole heap of other things you can do equally to get return on your investment, but it takes a lot more time.
What kind of, I know you want people to bring some data into the mentorship too, to analyze. What is there a certain protocol you would prefer someone to do to bring that, if they're bringing their heart rate data in?
So for the mentorship base, of what we'll try and do is if people can get baseline data, then we'll do probably just easy Wingates, because we would do a Wingate always.
Easy Wingates.
Yeah, well, Wingates are easy. I think for us, Wingates are so kind of like standard fare that when you get athletes doing, 15 on, 5 off, or 12, you're in a completely different world. I mean, that's the thing as well. Like, I will show the data on when we do the mentorship. People will be surprised when I talk about pushing hard. People's idea of pushing hard is probably not going to be the same as my idea of pushing hard, and I'll show people hitting 1,500 watts, 1,400 watts consistently on 12 bike sprints back to back on a negative rest interval. But they didn't get there. They didn't get there overnight. It took some time to get to that. I'll show football data, what steady state looks like during a game. We'll kind of dive into that type of thing. We'll look at 60-meter sprint with football players with change of direction, what that data kind of looks like. And we'll compare it, how it looks from a heart rate perspective versus how it looks from a near-infrared perspective. But from the analysing data, the easiest thing to do is to get a 30-second on, 60 off, or 2 or 3. Now, the reason we want more than the one standard Wingate is you're looking to see what the accumulated effect is on the second one. Because if you only...
Well, every time I do the second one, my legs stop working after 10 to 15 seconds.
Well, if you think about it, if you only do 30 on and 60 off, you're not really getting a repeated effort. So you're not really seeing what would happen if you did it again. So we like 30 on, 60 off for 2. If we can, and we think that people can do it, 3 is even better, because then we're looking at the subsequent knock-off effect. And that's when you can dive into more. So you can look at, what was the heart rate? Is there cardiac drift? I.e., is there no recovery between the sprints? What did power look like? How much did it drop off, etc.? And obviously, there's certain kind of caveats around all of that. If you're using a watt bike, the data might not be that accurate. If you're using a spin bike, it's maybe not have power, etc. So you kind of have to play with what you've got. But the idea will be to try and teach people you can find ways of getting things. It's not all about fancy kit. If you get a cheap watch or whatever, a cheap strap, you can get a lot of data from it. But it's more about, you have an athlete, they do XYZ sport. Like snowboarding was the hardest one for me. I was like, kind of snowboarding team were like, how do we condition them? And I was like, I know absolutely nothing about snowboarding. And I knew even less after I almost killed myself in the slopes going to learn snowboarding. That was the most horrific process ever. But that was a tougher one because you're kind of looking at half pipe and you're kind of thinking, well, what is the physiological demands of that? What did they really need? Like anything, you have to get data. And so we had to get nerves data, we had to get heart rate data, we get some acceleration data, because we're looking at, well, what exactly is occurring? And you start to see that actually has quite a lot of isometric components in it. There's a lot of isometrics in that. So that allowed us to see that muscle was desaturating, and some of them down to a very low position and not resaturating. And the more higher level ones were desatting but holding SMO2 much higher value. So they had a much more, I guess, acclimatization to isometric positions and holds. So from that allowed us to kind of create a whole heap of series of things to drill those type of people. So we looked at isometric pulls, pushes, and we looked at when we could optimize it. We looked at the flywheel systems, and the flywheel gave us the biggest bang for buck for snowboarders. That was the thing because, as you know yourself, with the good thing with the flywheel is you can make them break at 90 degrees in a squat. Just break and go, break and go, break and go. So you can force that whole explosive up, hard break into an isometric position, hold it, and then that whole thing about how do you come out of an isometric position with velocity.
Yeah.
I love all that stuff. And, so we kind of get into some of that stuff as well. So there's a whole heap of things you can do, but it all goes back down to the physiology. How is it happening and why is it happening? And once you understand that, plain sailing.
I remember I was talking to Matt Cross back home at the Hopeful in Sport. He ended up doing his PhD out in France with the ski team out there. You're telling me on the flywheel they'll do like that quarter squats, but 2 minutes continuous quarter squats on the flywheel for the slalom skiers. And I was like, dude, there's no way. Like that would be absolute killer to be able to do 2 minutes straight of quarter squats on a flywheel.
I tell you, I've kind of revisited the K-box. I led a research project on it. I think it's such an underused piece of kit. I think for me, especially in combat sports, there is a lot of deceleration points in braking. And I think one of the things I have issues with combat sports with a lot of S&C is we don't appreciate the need to brake and decelerate and change direction. So everything is very force-based. We need strength, we need strength, we need strength. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of like, well, we probably don't need as much strength as we think. We need, obviously, that conditioning to get us through it. But we need acceleration more to generate repeated force and power. Mm-hmm. And that isn't coming, via back squatting. It's not coming through deadlifting. So
I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah.
And I still get people coming at me for saying just traditional strength training isn't enough, or it's like just getting stronger doesn't do it.
But
there's more to strength.
For flywheel, you can go into a split squat position and you can really generate that whole movement range. And the thing about it as well is, you think about it, right? So how often is a boxer going below 90 degrees to throw an uppercut?
Maybe if they're doing some like jumping uppercut.
Yeah. That range of motion for the rec fem muscle is not actually as much as what people think it is. So people are trying to create acceleration from a very low end point, which is fine because, you're creating from the low end point and then it's going through that whole range of motion. But boxers actually have to create that acceleration from a third position point where the muscle is partially contracted, not fully contracted. That's a whole different kinetic experience. And the only thing that I've found that lets you do it is probably the K-box or the other versions of it. Because you can dial in that position to start, boom, push, go back to it, push, go, boom. And they can feel that whole chain. So my issue with S&C for striking is stuff like landmine press and that. It's maybe okay for the shoulders, I think it's crap. But it's not really dialing in kind of what you're trying to achieve, because unless you're fighting someone a lot higher than you, you're changing the whole glenohumeral joint position. The force should be coming in these straighter lines. But the flywheel really allows you to dial in. And as you know yourself, put two wheels on that thing. Jeez, that's a tough workout.
Dude, I did it with eccentric overload on the motor with just a small blue plate like that, just like a quarter split squat. Holy shit, man.
See, I don't have the motor. And it's,
yeah.
I keep thinking about the Exafly system. I'd like to have paper on it because eccentric overload is everything. So we had quite a lot of super bantamweights and bantamweights. And one of the challenges with those kids was, how do you kind of give them a little bit of muscle adaptation with it bulking up? Because they were very responsive to change, like super responsive to change. So feed them protein, let them do bicep curls, and they were becoming like monstrous. So the whole thought for me was like, if we lengthen muscle tissue and we kind of take that eccentric component, would we get the kind of same results as classic kind of hypertrophy or power training? And we found we actually get more in the super bantamweights. They just, for whatever reason, just doing a lot more eccentric overload and just lengthening the muscle tissue, just seemed to create a lot much more acceleration. And that's probably because the way we were training it. We're training a lot of pushes and a lot of pulls, single-handed with the angle grips. So the forearms are really getting engaged.
And you've also got muscle architecture changes that are positive to that too.
Yeah. And the angle grips for me with the K-box is probably one of the biggest finds as well. Because I just feel just that whole thing about having to grip it and having the forearms a little bit more engaged, it's paid dividends for us. So we had phenomenal results on the K-box. And then kind of like I took it into the uni for research and it sat there for a long time and the boxers were kind of complaining about it. So it's kind of, it's now with someone else at the moment. They're using it for training. But I keep thinking to myself, if I had the money, I'd maybe buy a couple more of them, because I think the other thing as well is you can get through a session on that super fast, like super quick. And
it doesn't give you the same soreness as other training, which is interesting.
No, I think initially, like some of the boxers were a bit sore after it for a couple of days. And then I think once they became quite accustomed to the eccentric overload, I think it kind of settled down quite nice. But the interesting thing was that I decided then to use it when other particular athlete I wanted to put some muscle mass on, some hypertrophy work. And we just kind of went for bigger weights. We took away the eccentric overload component and we just went for pure raw pull of the device, and we get big changes in muscle adaptation and size, which kind of led me to believe you can probably use it a multitude of ways.
100%.
And, you know, and everyone hates squats on it because that thing is just like,
Dude.
and I'm throwing the kids into it. I'm like, come on, go. You know, legs are getting compressed. People are crunching down. But it's a phenomenal piece of kit, and especially if you got the data with it, because you got all that nice range of motion. How accurate that is, I'm a bit kind of on the fence with, because it's just a wheel turning a small dial with a cord. So I'm a bit like, is it that accurate? But it's a benchmark of a starting place and an ending place. But I really like it as a training tool. Our strength training with athletes is really stripped back. We do a lot of single leg work with boxers. We do a lot of dumbbell work. We don't do a lot of barbell work. Now, that is just purely because I'm not there enough to do the barbell sessions. If I was there, we'd be doing a lot more complex work there. But I'm just not comfortable with athletes doing it themselves a lot of times, because I just think they half-arse it. They don't put as much effort into it. I think, you know, and I'm also not convinced that a lot of them are the right size and weight for their category. So I look around a lot of people are like, but they need, you know, we need to add more strength. And I was thinking, well, what is strength? What does that actually really mean in the sport of boxing? What is strength? Because grappling's completely different. You need that isometric, you need that hold position, completely different sport. But striking is about acceleration. The faster you can move your body, the better it is. So I think a lot of time, but I don't think plyos necessarily gives you that either. And the reason being, I think plyos are done in the wrong direction most of the times. So plyos are all...
You mean they're done vertical?
Yeah, they're all vertical. So I'm a big believer. And I think when you actually think of movement in the ring and you think of position, how often does an athlete make a massive big leap? There's a lot of foot tracking. So there's a lot of micro movement, kind of small adjustments for the foot, try to get the inside line of attack, the outside line of attack position, shoulder position. So I think the range of motion fits nicely on something like the K-box, because you can dial in small steps, drive, small steps, drive, small steps, drive. So I think for me, a lot of like hurdle jumps and all these things are too much of a jump. It's kind of like, so the inertia is going up rather than across, but I could be wrong in that. I'm not.
Well, you got plenty of other ways to do it too, because you obviously got lateral skater jumps, you got various directions you can do those jumps as well. So
yeah,
there's a billion ways you can modify it if you wanted to focus on, you know, I guess what they coined the force vector in training.
Yeah, I remember being quite obsessed with that years ago, and kind of S equals UT plus a half AT squares and displacement vectors and looking at all that type of stuff. And I remember just a good wise coach slapping me and saying, for Christ's sake, just get in boxing.
That's like the meme, right? The bell curve meme on the two ends and the one in the middle.
But it's true. It's like, you know, I mean, I've kickboxed. It's kind of, I kind of wonder how much of the training I did in my early 20s actually transferred into the sport. And probably not much of it, really, when it came to, I would have done much better if I'd spent more time sparring, control, doing tech sparring, and a lot more positional awareness, and a lot more probably, you know, kind of regress sparring, whereby you do a bit more technically orientated, where you kind of set up, you know, structure like task relevant cue based. I think things are probably a lot more probably benefit. You know, the older I get, the more I realise that it's the ability to do the sport that counts more than anything else.
Yep. Well, did you see the jiu-jitsu eco versus drilling debate that went on Instagram and stuff the other week?
Yeah, it's funny because when I started jits way back with Matt Thornton out in Portland, and that's originally I trained with SPG. Everything was like that. The whole aliveness concept was really there, and a lot of it was just drilling. And the last few times I've been back to do some BJ work, it's just all been rolling. It's, you know, I think there's something in being able to drill and then apply it. And I think the SPG method worked because of that whole idea. It was isolate it, drill it, know it, feel it, then put it into a live context and spar it out and see if it comes out. And I still think Matt Thornton was onto something back then. I get some good stories about back in the day there. You know, I enjoyed BJJ. I actually didn't enjoy BJJ that much. For me, it was a sport I hated because I just wanted to punch people and elbow them. But I appreciated what Matt Thornton was doing with the whole aliveness idea. And I think, you know, I trained a lot with Carl Tanswell as well back in the day, and Anthony Thompson and stuff. over here. PG took a real strange shift in Scotland. It went down very much to kind of Gracie Barra kind of route of kind of.
Wow, yeah.
But it lost, I think, a lot of the aliveness. It became kind of how green and how much.
Became a curriculum.
It became a curriculum. It became the pay to win model.
Yeah.
You know, which is kind of interesting. But I guess that's what happens, isn't it? That's what sport does. It becomes, how do we monetize it? How do we make a living out of it? Pay to win's it's probably a good way.
It's shifting the other way though.
Yeah.
It's definitely gone away from the old Gracie and old, I guess, Brazilian way, slowly.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because up in Aberdeen, there was kind of Carlson Gracie kind of BJJ, which was pretty full on. Back in the day, it was pretty full on. You know, it was drill, then we're rolling. You know, and it was very much like, that's what you need to pull off today. You know, get that omoplata, you know, get that triangle, and, you know, get that Darson. That was very much like that. And then down the Glasgow end, it kind of, there's some pretty solid gyms that are still that way as well, like Grip House and stuff like that, some really solid places. But for me, it just wasn't a sport that I loved nearly as much as punching people. And kicking people in the liver, like Savat style, is just a magical thing. It's not so magical when it happens to you and you're pissing blood for 7 days, but it's a magical thing when it lands. Nothing beats a good liver shot. You know, and that's for me why I guess even I had my gym and we had people teaching BJJ at the gym. I never really took part much. I just was purely striking orientated. I still do pads. I'll still do a bit of body sparring with the kids. I still love that whole. I think boxing teaches you distance. And I think things like box Francais Savat, where there's a slightly more elongated position on the fouetté kick and stuff, teaches you another appreciation of distance. And Muay Thai gives you an even other form of distance. And I think those three together just create a completely amazing striking system where you can move through range and you understand. But the great thing about it is no box jumps are needed to be successful. No landmine presses are needed to be successful. It's just doing the sport and just having a good conditioning base, relative strength for the weight category you're in. Job to do, you know? So, yeah.
That's perfect. That's a perfect way to almost end this 2 hour podcast. So guys, make sure you check the description. You got to get into that mentorship. $497 for the 2 month, which is actually pretty insane. How cheap that is for the entire 8-week course, plus 2 live calls a month, plus the forum community area, plus crunching data and your data that you bring, which is pretty. I'm gonna bring some data too. I found my heart rate monitor finally, so I'm gonna try it on my dodgy spin bike and get some new stuff on there. And then I was talking to a friend who's one of the top grapplers in New Zealand. I'm trying to get him to get a bloody heart rate monitor so he can do some too. So that'll be interesting as well because he's a heavier dude too.
It'll be good. So we're going to cover a whole heap of things. So week 1 will be pretty light. Week 2, we're going to get into energy continuum, substrate utilization, touching metabolism. Then we're going to look at things such as heart rate, NARS, discuss a little bit about GPS and some thoughts around that because I think some interesting things around that. Then we'll look at things such as, you know, test and assess. How do we do it? How do you devise your test? What's the best way of doing it? We'll look at data capture, best practice for handling data, especially if you're using things, you know, like say if you're using a train red where it's like a 10 hertz sample and you're maybe doing an hour's spar session, whatever, and there's a lot of data. How do you break that down? How do you process it? And then we'll kind of just look at, you know, what do you do with that data? How do you analyze curves? How do you analyze polynomials? You know, what is the effect of them? And then, you know, and then we'll dive into how do you put it together. Live chats will be fortnightly, so we'll kind of do that on a poll system. So we'll kind of find out what works for everyone. I'm happy to do 2 chats if we need to do 2 chats to accommodate time zones. I'm pretty cool with that. That's just going to be a real just dive into what people want to know and stuff. The idea will be week by week there'll be content, and the live chat we're going to reinforce that a little bit. But it's really more about finding out what people's sports are and what it is they really want to understand. So it should be good. It's not going to have crazy numbers on it because it'd be too time demanding. So you're not going to be only like 60 people in a cohort. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be nicely targeted, but it is a first come, first served business because, you know, we will cap it. I'll still work out what the cap is. But it's the same material that we give to rugby clubs. Just to put it in perspective, my hourly rate for that type of thing is £125 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So 4 hours of work is 600.
So you're getting Andrew at a discounted rate.
Very discounted. feel like I'm selling myself out. But the reason for doing it really is to try and make people a bit more efficient with what they're doing, to, and to give it maybe a slightly different approach to it. But it'll be interesting because it'll be interesting to get other people's approach and to see what other people are doing as well. Because the way I have learned over the years is by learning from others. I'm a big believer in mentorship. I'm very lucky that I surround myself with people like John. I love chatting with Gary Hutt at Team GB because Gary's got a very leveling way of putting things in its place, which I really, really like. I like speaking with yourself. I like to constantly be challenged on what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I think that's the best way to kind of learn. And I'm in a very lucky point in my life whereby I don't need to advertise for clients. I'm busy all the time. I can pick and choose what I want to do. And we've been super, super successful. It's kind of like the biggest pain in my life is probably NDAs because we sign no end NDAs with athletes all the time. It's quite painful. But on the other hand, I kind of like it to an extent because then there's no bullshit or ego. And such, look at him.
Yeah, underground.
Yeah, I mean, we work a lot. And because we work a lot with different people, like a lot of high-level elite people, but we just don't post about it because we can't. And it's, I think that's a double-edged sword. I think if I was younger, that'd be more of a problem. But at this point in my day, it's not a problem. But I can imagine if I was 27, 28, you kind of want to use that for marketing, it's going to be a big issue. But at 52, I don't really give a shit. Oh, it's more about the excitement of taking someone on a journey, finding out what it is you need to know about them and applying it. And that's what kind of keeps me still in it. So yes, sign up, find out information below somewhere or wherever it is. And
yep, it'll be in the description for you guys as well. And yeah, highly worth it. I mean, I get to talk to Andrew a fair whack and interview him, stuff like this, and fully change my outlook on conditioning and the physiology side. And I know it will do the same. I mean, it's done the same for a bunch of others that just listen to the hour-long podcast, So now imagine like immersing yourself in this is just another level on top.
Yeah, I mean, it's been strange for me, I guess. I've really been privileged with some of the people that have kind of come forward to chat with us about our ideas and stuff, and it's been quite surprising because some of these people we hold in super high esteem as well. We think, wow, they're really phenomenal coaches. So it's quite a humbling process that people are kind of, and we're not doing anything crazy or anything new. The nurse is probably the newest thing because we're probably amongst the first to do it, right? But everything else is just stuff that John's known for 35 years, stuff I've known for 15, 20 years. It's nothing new. It's just, I guess,
just need to get it out there.
I think I was saying to John yesterday, I think what it is that me and him are like so antisocial that we've not really been tainted with the whole world of, strangeness. So this is all like, so we're like probably two Neanderthals that just hit the city for the first week. We're like, what's going to get on here? Why are people saying that? Twig, fire. It's kind of like, so for us, everything's, and it's bizarre, right? Because for me, the whole idea of substrate utilization, intensity, and contribution levels of substrates just seems very matter of fact because that's what you teach undergrads. So when people are saying to me, actually, we're only using PCR for the first 15 seconds, I'm like, what are you talking about?
Surely people are getting past that because I swear when I post stuff like that now, I get a lot of people sharing it and agreeing with it. Maybe it's just because it's an echo chamber of what my audience is, and it hasn't reached the masses yet. But I think people are starting to come around. Maybe not the masses.
I think a lot of people bought into this whole idea of kind of like intervals, being an MICT interval, being a HIIT interval, being this, and kind of bought into this whole lactic style training off of previous, people without really questioning, did that actually stack up physiologically? And I think that held ground for quite a long, long period of time. I mean, and it
still has.
And it probably did for me to a small extent until I want to test this. And I went and got and paid a lot of money for metabolic carbs and portable ones. And then I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense because, the craziest thing for me was that I had no interest in NURS. I just had bought them in a complete whim. I just bought them. And I had them on at the time I was doing the pilot research and I was looking at, the carbohydrate utilization and the VO2 peak between rounds and and kind of bag work and stuff. And I was looking at the Moxies thinking, if we're in a purely PCR zone, why the fuck is that muscle desaturating and resaturating at the rate that it's doing it at? Why is that doing completely something very different to this idea of being in a highly anaerobic position? And that was the catalyst for me. And then I just put them on it. So even before my research, I've got 4 years of data from sparring, bag session, pad work, grappling session, MMA fights, football sessions. Just can't use any of it for research because there's no ethical approval. But I've got legacy data from some of the best fighters on the planet with it. And that was the catalyst. That's why when I said to John, well, I'm going to do the PhD now, and he's like, cool. And he was like, let's just abandon the whole substrate business and let's just go straight into peripheral, because you've got 5 years of knowledge there that's sitting. And we've got all this provisional data that's showing us that something is happening peripherally. It's very different to systemically. Let's dive into that.
Could you publish that data anonymously as like a blog or something?
I probably could, actually. I probably could.
That'd be interesting.
Because some really interesting data, how we used it for sparring and how we controlled one opponent over the other opponent. And that was a big, that's when I realized at that point you could actually use near infrared for actual game time, and off the back of that, you could sort of change a lot of game plans and how the athlete performs. So it was pretty interesting. But in an exciting world, wearable technology, the most accessible it's ever been. AI is incredibly useful for coding. So it doesn't take much to get AI to write you a decent script to analyze your data. So we're in very exciting times. So
yeah, I still want to use the bloody knees. I still want to do some stuff in grappling, wrestling, or jiu-jitsu just to have that data and see what's going on. I'm sure it's not going to be that much different to what you saw in your research, but it'll just be interesting just to see and quantify what's going on, because for example, the research in jiu-jitsu is like 10 plus years old, which is like a completely different game. And we don't know a lot of these things. And even in wrestling, there's like not much going on.
It's on our list of things to look at. Obviously, as mentioned before, I was spoken to someone else about potentially getting some nice data in that. I'm kind of interested in looking at the transition between striking into maybe the clinch position or into single leg, and just how that differs. I'm interested in seeing it from both ends. I'm interested from being the attacker and versus being the defender that's actually taken down.
Or even someone takes a shot in MMA and then they get back to the fence and stand back up and then start striking again, like that transition. How taxing is it really?
I mean,
and how well are people recovering?
We've got some really cool research lined up. One is the virtual reality stuff, which is kind of interesting, but the other is looking at, I had to play with kind of haptic feedback sets, the Tesla ones that really generate a shitload of pain.
Wait, the ones like that's like electrodes on your body, so when you get hit
these
in
are
virtual
like
reality,
all over body haptic sensors, so they can spasm you up big time. You can just, that is crazy what you can do with them.
Dude, fuck that, man.
But what I'm kind of interested in is if we can simulate impact, then what is the physiological response to it, and what's the accumulated physiological? Now, it'd be very doubtful to get ethics doing a project like that, but we might get something similar through on it. But I'm kind of curious about kind of how does muscle function in different environments and things, because we know the heat has got a slightly different, change versus kind of humid or kind of like normal conditions as well, ambient. Impact trauma is a really interesting one. So one of the big projects that we've got going at the moment is this whole idea of how do we use nerves to bring it into the gaming space so we can manipulate outcomes in games. So like first-person shooters and stuff. How do we actually change up environments and terrains based upon kind of how the muscles responding through certain things? The next logical thing with that would be the if you've maybe seen kind of like Google and that have got the kind of walk on mini haptic treadmills where you can run. Yeah. So we've got someone playing around with them, looking at sprints on them and looking at kind of whole haptic and nerves and kind of how does that change. So the next thing for me is looking at, can you apply that to kind of striking drills and how that affects. So there's a whole interesting world, and that's the thing is that we still don't really fully know how muscle really functions under different environments, which is why even with the stuff that we do, we kind of caveat by saying this is what we know, but there's a whole heap of world that we do not know. So therefore, we're not going to make recommendations and things that we're unsure about or out with our expertise, because I think it's important to stay within your remit.
So yeah, perfect.
Right,
let's put it into something now.
That's it.
And yeah, appreciate you coming on. and sign up in the link below.